I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Dr. Etzel Cardeña, the head of CERCAP, the Center for Research on Consciousness and Anomalous Psychology at Lund University in Sweden. Dr. Cardeña is a professor at Lund University and holds the Thorsen Chair in Psychology, including Parapsychology and Hypnosis. He teaches courses on altered states of consciousness and parapsychology and clinical and experimental hypnosis, and conducts and supervises research in these areas of interest. He's a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the Association for Psychological Science, among other organizations. He's the author of close to 400 publications, and his research, theoretical, and pedagogical contributions have received awards from 4 different professional organizations, as well as the University of Texas. Most recently, he received the 2021 Outstanding Career Award from the Parapsychological Association for his work. So, Etzel, welcome, sir. It is truly a pleasure and an honor to speak with you today. And since our focus is on the paranormal, let me start out by asking you, what inspired you to get into this field of study?
Sure. I grew up in Mexico. My father was a psychoanalyst who was also interested in parapsychology, and he did some activities that were not really scientific studies, but nonetheless, he was knowledgeable of it. So as I was growing up and my parents were talking about reading books by Ryan and so on, for me, this was not paranormal. It was normal. It was something that happens that we know little about, but not more than that, as we know very little about many things. So early on, for me, that was something that was normal, part of being a human being, or part of being perhaps a sentient being. And as far as getting into altered states, that did not come through psychology, it came through theater. I have been a professional actor, director, and so on. And at one point I was doing very physically demanding experimental theater. And just given the strenuous physical activities we had, I experienced some altered states that allow me to do things that I would ordinarily not be able to do. So at that point, I thought, well, I'm studying psychology, and my studies say nothing about what I'm experiencing, which to me seemed very important. So both parapsychology and getting into altered state was, in a sense, part of my growing up.
Okay. Well, now I want to get into your paper, The Experimental Evidence for Parapsychological Phenomena, a Review. So this was published in 2018 in American Psychologist, a journal of the American Psychological Association. Can you start us out by telling us a little bit about the focus and scope of this paper?
Sure, absolutely. What this paper, in a sense, comes out of my having co-edited a book in 2015, in which I tried to bring up to date what we know about parapsychology. So this was an edited book. There we had a number of experts on various fields. And after having done all that tremendous work, I had a sense, an overall scoping sense of where the field was. But at that point, we did not have in the book itself sort of a summarizing chapter. So I decided to write a paper in which I would give a bird's eye view of where the field is and what we know of it. So that's how it happened. I submitted it to American Psychologist, which is the flagship of the American Psychological Association. It goes to more than 100,000 psychologists in the world. And to be honest, I did not think that it was going to be even given any attention. But the acting editor was courageous. It's not that he was convinced or that he's a side proponent, but he's an open scientist. And he said, well, I think this deserves attention. Your paper is serious. And so we went through a very long process of edits, re-edits, revisions, which I think actually ended up helping the paper to be sharper, to speak not only to the choir, and to not speak only against the people who are very much anti-psi, but to have a scoping view that would be more of greater general interest to the greater audience that American Psychologist has.
Mm. Well, so I don't want to keep the audience in suspense. I'm jumping around a little bit in my questions here, but
Fine.
okay, Dr. Julia Mossbridge told me about this paper, and I believe Dr. Bernie Beitman mentioned it as well. Both of them described it as a breakthrough, and I think it's a breakthrough not only in what you're discussing, but as well as your conclusions and the fact that this is a peer-reviewed paper that was published through the American Psychological Association. So the conclusion, what you've written was, the evidence provides cumulative support for the reality of psi, which cannot be readily explained away by the quality of studies, broad selective reporting, experimental or analytical incompetence, or other frequent criticisms. So in other words, a detailed analysis of studies published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal is saying that psychic powers are real.
Okay, let me start with the very last sentence. I would put it more, we have evidence for psi phenomena. We have evidence that is as strong, or as weak if you wish, but as strong as that of areas in psychology, biology, medicine, and even neurosciences. It has evidence that is as strong, if not stronger in some cases. So my conclusion was, if you're going to judge psi phenomena according to the criteria that people use to judge whether something has been validated, whether something is worth considering, then it has been validated a long time ago, and it has been validated by thousands of studies that have been analyzed statistically and show these results. Now, I don't like to say, well, this is the reality, because I think in science, you never know. And the more I know about the mind and consciousness and reality, the less I know, or the less sure I am of things. Because right now, for example, we would say, of course you are real, of course there is time, of course time goes in a certain sequence, of course there are solid objects. And then here comes contemporary physics and says, well, no, things are not quite as simple as you think they are. So what I say is, at this point, given what we know, these have been validated according to the criteria used to validate other areas in science.
Well, so you'd mentioned that this went out to close to 100,000 psychologists. And again, I mean, these are big ideas and big assertions in this paper. What kind of response have you had to this so far?
Well, I would say mostly positive. It has been referenced around close to 200 times, which in some areas might not sound like much, but in parapsychology is a lot.
Yeah.
And I would say mostly has been positive. There was one countervailing paper that came out of it. It was a rebuttal, and it came out in American Psychologist. And I'm sure that the editor got a lot of pressure from people saying, no, how did you dare publish that? And in it, the authors, Reverend Alcock, instead of dealing with the actual data and the analysis of the paper, they basically said, well, according to physics, these phenomena are impossible, so we should not take them into consideration. We should not even look at them, which a number of people, including some critics of psi, took them to task for. They said, well, no, in science, we do not have certainties. We deal with what evidence there is. And if you find some problem, you mention it instead of saying, well, this is just impossible, so forget about it. So I would say mostly positive. There was that rebuttal. That rebuttal has not had much traction. I can see from the number of references it has had. And it was criticized even by people who are not particularly sympathetic to psi, but said, well, that's not a good argument against. If you find some fault with the reporting, with the analysis, with the methods, mention them. But don't just say, well, this just because it is impossible, we're just going to disregard it. And by the way, the two people who wrote it who say, well, according to physics, blah, 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 are not physicists themselves.
Yeah.
Nor am I, by the way. But I mentioned that, well, I am reading physicists, and I know that in physics, there is not a single voice. There are some physicists like Sean Carroll who say, well, psi phenomena are impossible. There are equally eminent, at least physicists, who say yes, we have evidence and we have models that accommodate such phenomena. So, you know, I always feel quizzical when somebody starts speaking for another discipline and furthermore assumes that that discipline has only one voice.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you'd mentioned in the paper was quantum mechanics, and potentially quantum mechanics could offer some insights. You'd mentioned non-locality, right? And again, that's one aspect of the psi phenomena. And so normally QM is applied, right, on the scale of subatomic particles. And you know, there are a lot of issues to scaling that up, but it does seem that science is seeing larger and larger, I guess, aggregate QM effects over time. Do you think that quantum mechanics may offer a potential explanation for at least the mechanism of psi effects, if not the actual, you know, what's going on inside the brain?
Yes, you put it very well. I think I should probably just use your final two sentences because you put it well. QM has the potential to offer explanations. I will not say that it has, that we now have a theory that explains in detail how psi works, what is the nature of psi. We do not have that. We have proposals, we have some theories about how it might work. But as you mentioned, QM has been found in increasingly larger systems, not only at a subatomic level, but at a macroscopic level. So that's one point. But I think the other point that needs to be said is that in a universe that, in our latest account, there may be a later future account that will be different, but in our current account in QM, that is amenable to non-locality, to future events happening in the future being able to affect the past, as in retrocausality, that at least see the potentiality for that in a universe that has those phenomena. Psi phenomena are actually not that strange.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. In fact, I have an interview scheduled with a doctor later this week who's going to be talking about retrocausality, right? And so a lot of these things that we've looked at in the past and said there's no way this is impossible, you know, now in the 21st century, we're starting to see ways that they could be possible. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with you there. Now, so quantum mechanics is again one potential explanation. I wanted to ask a little bit about what kind of psychic events are most supported by data. Is it typically information events? Because I know in the paper you had discussed both PK, psychokinesis, as well as different forms of ESP and again, knowledge of the future, things along those lines, I guess. What's most supported and what's least supported?
Yes, I would say what is called in lay people's term ESP, extrasensory perception, which probably does not have to do with perception itself, but let's say phenomena that, as you put, have to do with information, either information that is non-locally or non-temporally close, that is information happening somewhere else or happening in the future. I would say that those are overall fairly well validated or established, at least in comparison with validated accepted areas. When we get to psychokinesis, the notion that intentions can affect matter, I would then make a distinction between what is called micropsychokinesis and macro. Micro is the ability to affect very small systems, quantum systems, and so on. And here, for instance, the work of Helmut Schmidt, the work of Dean Radin do offer a number of studies that have found that people seem to be able to affect at a very small level, but nonetheless are able to affect quantum systems. Now, bear in mind, you know, this is a very small effect. So it's something that you will not be able to see in everyday life, which actually makes complete sense. I always tell my students, listen, if psychokinesis were actually had large effects, we would be killing people because we hate them. We would have been killed a long time ago. I say, you know, I would have killed a number of people in my life, but I would have been killed before because we all have all kinds of strong intentions. And that does not happen. What may happen is perhaps that there's a small effect. Actually, in the case of psychokinesis, one of the stronger effects we have is for trying to affect biological systems. But still, those are small effects. So if you have somebody who's sick and you give it all your best intention and you have abilities, it doesn't mean that they're going to suddenly stand up and say, I'm cured. Doesn't seem to be work that way. But there is evidence for micropsychokinesis. When we get into macro, that is, people affecting large objects, things you can see, lift tables, start levitating, and so on. Here I would come up with two different observations. The first is that macropsychokinesis has unfortunately a long story of frauds, of people, doing ectoplasm that is coming out of their mouth or other places in their bodies, and it's later analyzed and it's nothing ethereal, and that has happened. So I would say that overall there's not much research that has shown macropsychokinetic effects to be valid. Having said that, there are a few cases in the literature in which exceptional people, and I would say one person every couple of decades or so, seem to show those effects and could not be dismissed as fraudulent. But for instance, the case of D.D. Hume last century or 19th century, who was observed to levitate by a number of scientists who were trying to catch him, and magicians who were trying to catch him doing something. They were not able to show anything. The case of Ted Sirius, who seemed to be able to affect Polaroid cameras. Again, there were a number of phenomena that are not easily explainable, but these are very rare. So if you were to ask me, I would put my money in, yes, information is the most validated, the strongest one. Micropsychokinesis, I think there is good evidence, but for a very, very small effect, which makes sense in the world that we live. And macropsychokinesis, it may be something that happens very, very rarely, and many other things that are expressed or manifested may not be actually real, but maybe fraudulent or shows or things of that sort. So that's where I stand.
Yeah, well, no, and I appreciate you clarifying that. And this idea of micropsychokinesis is really interesting, like considering things like the Global Consciousness Project, right? Where people may be able to affect these random number counters. And I believe that's been running for like 20-something years now.
Yes.
And that it runs statistically high, if I remember correctly. So
it runs statistically high, but one needs to make a distinction between what is statistically significant and what is the effect size. So statistically significant means this distribution, this effect would happen by random very, very, very rarely. So there is a deviation. So instead of the random number generators coming 50% ones and 50% zeros, it ends up coming, let's say, 50.7% ones and 49.3% zeros. That when you take a very, very long observation becomes statistically very significant, but the effect size, that is how much it deviates from randomness, is relatively small. And that happens also with the Global Consciousness Project. It is nonetheless extremely important because you have to say there is something here that is not explained by the typical physics notions of what we have in the universe. So it has to be added, even if it has a very small effect. And in physics, scientists deal with very small effects. When there was a new particle is found, it is typically a very small effect that was only observed after millions, if not trillions of observations. And then they found that there was a very tiny deviation that was unlikely to happen by random, but nonetheless, it was very tiny, and perhaps it vanished very soon after it showed up. That small particle just disappeared very soon afterwards.
Yeah. Well, another thing that you discussed in the paper, and this for me was really exciting was the kind of evolutionary theories of psi and the fact that there is a tremendous evolutionary advantage in being able to identify danger outside of an organism's sensory reach. And so one thing I'm wondering is, do you think that these abilities are something that our ancestors evolved or something that we may be still evolving towards?
Yes. Well, I think that it's not only ancestors, but I know that you also wanted to ask me about non-human animals.
Yeah.
And there is evidence for non-human animals at having these capabilities. Nonetheless, what I would have to say, it is typically not a very strong effect, because at the same time that you might say, well, yes, it would make a lot of sense that it goes for your evolutionary fitness to be able to predict where danger is going to come from. Nonetheless, we are also always very distracted by perceptual information. Yeah. We attend mostly what we see, what we hear. So if there is a small, if you will, voice or intuition that is there, that may be easily flooded by everything else. So I think that, yes, there is an advantage to having some psi ability. But if anything, I do not believe that we are evolving to have greater and greater amount of it. Because right now, for example, if I want to find out how is Tim Ventura doing, I will send you an email. I do not need to try to have a telepathic communication that may be faint, that may be embedded within a lot of your thoughts and my thoughts. It's much easier. So nowadays, we do not really seem to need very much psi phenomena. I think its greater importance is in what it tells us about the nature of consciousness and of reality.
Well, if I can ask about that, and that's none of my questions, but I mean, I guess if I could ask what your thoughts are on that, because I know that that's one of the great mysteries, right? I don't think anyone has the answers, but do you have any insights, I guess, on consciousness and the nature of reality?
Well,
I know that that's not an easy question, but
I had a similar interview. I think it was last week, and my answer then was, and we were running out of time, I said, "Who knows?" But let me expand it a bit more, since we may have a bit more time here. And I would say that increasingly a number of thinkers are coming to the notion that we cannot explain, at least easily explain, or that nobody has been able to come up with a good theory of how we evolved suddenly from what seems to be non-sentient matter to consciousness. So I think not everyone, of course, but many people, including people that started as very mainstream neuroscientists like Koch and so on, have ended up shading more to the notion that consciousness is an irreducible constitutive part of reality. That the same way that we have matter and energy and time and space, which, by the way, are not the way that we experience them according to contemporary physics, and physics does not explain what actually they are. What is matter? Well, quanta, or maybe waves, or maybe at times quanta, maybe at times waves. When you look at that, we don't really know. So for me, the matter is not anti-matter. It is that we don't even know what matter is, and that it makes sense to at least consider the possibility that matter, all matter, from the beginning of creation, may have some kind of mentality or sentience. Does not mean that my table has the same existential angst as I do, as I think about my demise, although the table will probably at some point will also ended up being scrapped. But there is nonetheless something within a larger system in which the table is embedded, in which I am embedded, that does have a certain kind of purposefulness. That may be something that we do not even realize or understand very well, but it is part of a constitutive part of what reality is. So that is my more elaborate answer, if you will, that I think more and more we're starting to get a sense of what has been thought of by a number of indigenous groups, not everyone, but a number of them, who said, well, there's a kind of living universe.
Yeah.
And it is not just something that we are separate parts of a mechanism that just interact with each other, but that there is a larger system that may have some kind of purposefulness or mentality. And I think exploring that idea is certainly consistent with the findings of psi phenomena, and increasingly with a failure to provide by as I would say, simplistic materialist account how we get consciousness.
Yeah. Well, I believe they call that the hard problem, right? And there's this issue of qualia, and there's this part of it where you can go so deep, but you just can't quite solve it. And maybe this would offer insights into that solution. So
yes, but then it would be a matter of not saying, well, matter is just something brute, non-sentient, but there is in matter something that is more and more realized according to let's say the development of the species, but it is not that. It is just brute non-mentality, not participating in a larger system. So if you take a larger view of consciousness, then it becomes something that may be solvable, and at least is consistent with psi. Because in psi, essentially what we're proposing is that we are interconnected, and time is not only as we experience it. And these are consistent ideas with contemporary physics. So this is that we do not know the details. So we do not know the details of many things. Dark matter, well, supposedly, again, I'm not a cosmologist, but dark matter is supposed to just pervade the whole of the universe. No clue what it is or how it works. So we are far from having full explanations, and we may never be able to get them because we see things only from our own particular limited way of cognizing and perceiving the universe. And I'm glad for it, but I also realize that it is just one way of apprehending things. It is not the ultimate, the only one, the only valid one. It's just one way.
Absolutely. Well, Etzel, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. And again, let me thank you for publishing this paper. I also agree that this is truly a breakthrough, one of many, I guess. So let me close by asking, what comes next for yourself and for the future of scientific inquiry into the paranormal?
Well, I am here. I'm doing right now, in collaboration with a number of centers in the world, a study on using Ganzfeld, which is a way of, in a sense, doing sensory deprivation. And we are going to test a psi Ganzfeld method using many people and many laboratories. So that is what is most immediate. More generally, I think at some point, I would like to develop a book in which I will go to my actually more central interest, which is not as much parapsychology, but alterations of consciousness. And the notion, which I experienced since I was a teen, I guess, that they're not just weird, strange, irrational, deluded ways of being in the world, but that they may offer valid, useful insights and ways of being in the world. So at some point, I think I will sit down and start again collapsing what I have been learning out of my ignorance and out of other people's work and try to make sense out of it.
Wonderful. Thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Thank you, Tim. Have a good day.